There are days when nothing inside you dies. It just dims. Not enough to alarm anyone, not enough to break you, just enough to make you feel like you're living underwater, watching the rest of the world move with a brightness you can't reach. You wake up, and the first thing you notice isn't exhaustion. It's the absence of anything that could push you forward, a quiet, steady emptiness that doesn't scream, doesn't panic, doesn't demand attention. It just sits there, right behind your ribs, like a fog that learned how to stay. Most people imagine emotional pain as something loud, something dramatic, something that grabs you by the throat and refuses to let go. But the truth I've watched in friends and strangers and myself, is that some of the most devastating forms of suffering are soft. They arrive like a dimmer switch turning down the lights inside your nervous system. You don't collapse, you don't break down, you simply stop responding. And at first, it feels manageable. A skipped reaction here, a fading interest there. You tell yourself it's just a phase, just a slump, just stress. But somewhere between the third missed call and the seventh unfinished thought, you realize something heavier is happening, something quieter but far more persistent. You're not losing motivation, you're losing emotional access. That's the core pain hiding beneath this kind of numbness. You still want to feel, but the bridge between wanting and actually feeling has collapsed. You remember what joy used to feel like. You remember what connection used to spark. You remember what curiosity used to stir in you. But now, all of that feels like a memory of a memory, something secondhand, distant, faint. And maybe you've tried to explain it to someone. Maybe you've said, "I'm just tired," or "I'm overwhelmed," or the classic American survival phrase, "I'm fine." But the truth is harder to say out loud. I can't feel anything the way I used to, and I don't know how to come back. That's the part that rarely gets spoken. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's subtle. And subtle pain is the easiest to hide, especially in a country where everyone is taught to function, to keep up, to push through, to stay productive, even while they're falling apart internally. There's a specific kind of loneliness that comes from emotional dimming, not the loneliness of being without people, the loneliness of being without yourself. And here's something important, something most people don't realize until they're deep in the fog. This isn't apathy. Apathy is not caring. What you're experiencing is caring without the fuel to show it. It's wanting without access. It's the emotional version of trying to start a car whose battery is slowly dying. The engine doesn't scream, it just doesn't turn over. The deeper truth is that numbness isn't the enemy. It's the message. It's the quiet alarm system your brain uses when it's been carrying too much, too long, too silently. It's what happens when nervous systems built for survival begin to shut down non-essential operations, like joy or longing or even hope, just to keep you functioning. And that scares people, not because they fear becoming empty, but because they fear staying empty. That fear, subtle, quiet, invisible, is the emotional nucleus of everything you're struggling with. The fear that your inner world won't turn back on. The fear that whatever broke inside you is permanent. The fear that you've gone too far into the fog to find your way out. But numbness isn't a dead end. It's a threshold, a border between the version of you who coped by shutting down and the version of you who hasn't learned, yet, how to feel safely again. And that's the part the outside world doesn't see. You're not cold, you're not lazy, you're not indifferent, you're not giving up. You're protecting yourself the only way your nervous system knows how. Because the truth most people never say out loud, is that emotional shutdown isn't a failure of character. It's a survival reflex. The human mind was never meant to absorb endless noise, constant pressure, infinite expectation, or the quiet ache of being needed by everyone but understood by no one. At some point, the system breaks rank. It says, "No more," and reroutes energy away from the parts of you that feel so the parts of you that function can stay alive. You haven't disappeared, you've just gone dim. And dimness, despite how terrifying it feels, is still a form of light. When the world inside you goes quiet, it isn't a sign of collapse. It's the first fragile sign of a system trying to protect itself the only way it can. You're not broken, you're not empty, you're not gone. You're just in that gray drifting space where your feelings used to live, waiting for the moment when your system finally has the safety to turn them back on. And that's where our story continues. Imagine a small apartment in Seattle, top floor, overlooking nothing spectacular, just a row of aging brick buildings and a handful of maple trees that have long since lost their color for the season. It's early morning, but the sky is the muted gray that never really decides if it wants to become day or stay night forever. Inside, a person sits at a desk. They're not doing anything in particular, just staring at the soft glow of a laptop screen, watching the cursor blink like a tiny heartbeat that somehow feels more alive than they do. The coffee beside them has gone cold, not because they forgot about it, but because remembering doesn't make any difference. The taste won't land anyway. The apartment is silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the static of someone scrolling through news headlines they won't remember. There's a jacket thrown over a chair. A plant near the window that should have been watered 2 days ago. A phone face down on the table, buzzing every once in a while with messages that feel like they belong to someone else's life. It's the kind of scene you'd walk past without noticing, the ordinary quiet of an American weekday morning. But if you could step inside that person's mind, you'd hear something different. A stillness that isn't peaceful, a quiet that isn't chosen. It's the sound of an inner world that dimmed without warning. They open a blank document, type 3 words, delete them, type something else, delete again. Not because they're unsure, but because nothing feels right when nothing feels at all. Outside, the maple trees sway in a gentle breeze. A dog walker passes by, bundled in a scarf. Somewhere down the street, a bus lets out a sigh of compressed air. Life moves, life continues. Life asks nothing from them and everything at the same time. They rest their head in their hands, not dramatically, just with the weight of someone realizing they haven't had a genuine emotional reaction in days, maybe weeks, maybe longer than they're willing to admit. This is the kind of numbness that looks harmless from the outside. No tears, no shaking, no meltdown, just slow withdrawal, as if someone is quietly boxing up the colors of their inner world and putting them into storage. The apartment lights flicker slightly as the sun tries to break through the clouds. It doesn't succeed, but for a moment, a faint beam lands on the plant by the window, a plant that somehow keeps living even when neglected. They look up, not because they feel inspired, but because something in that tiny, stubborn plant mirrors their own existence better than anything else right now. Alive, but muted. Present, but barely glowing. They pick up their phone, see a message from a friend asking, "Are you free this Saturday?" Their thumb hovers over the keyboard. For a moment, they consider replying, but the effort of making a decision, any decision, feels like lifting a weight they don't have the strength for. The phone goes back down, face down, like always. The cursor blinks on the laptop again, a heartbeat without a body. If you were standing behind them, you wouldn't think anything was wrong. They're calm, they're quiet, they're functioning. But that's the thing about emotional numbness. It rarely disrupts the surface of someone's life. It just erodes the meaning underneath it. They close the laptop, not out of frustration, not out of avoidance. It simply feels pointless to keep it open. The room darkens again as clouds pull across the sky. The refrigerator hums. Someone downstairs slams a car door. A distant siren wails for a few seconds and then fades. Nothing dramatic happens. Nothing breaks. Nothing explodes. And that's the quiet tragedy of this moment. Nothing changes, and that's exactly the pain. Because when numbness settles into a life, it doesn't arrive like storm damage. It arrives like slow dust, layer by layer, day by day, covering everything until even the things you once loved feel wrapped in a soft, unreachable haze. They stand up, walk to the window, and rest their forehead against the cold glass. Outside, people are moving, living, feeling, reacting. They don't envy them. They don't resent them. They simply watch, the way someone watches a movie with the sound turned off. Familiar shapes, familiar rhythms, but no emotional pull. And in that silent moment, forehead against the glass, they whisper a thought they wouldn't dare say aloud. What happened to me? If you could peel back the quietness inside you, if you could see what's happening beneath the emotional dimming, you'd find something far less mysterious than it feels. You'd find a nervous system doing exactly what it was designed to do, just not in the way you hoped. The modern world paints emotion as a moral thing. If you're motivated, you're strong. If you're resilient, you're admirable. If you're tired, unfocused, or numb, you're failing somehow. But biology doesn't care about any of that. Your brain isn't wired for symbolic meaning. It's wired for survival. And numbness, despite how eerie, shameful, or frustrating it feels, is a survival response. Let's start with something simple, something most people never get taught. Your emotions don't live in your personality. They live in your nervous system. Every sensation, excitement, warmth, curiosity, longing, is a chemical and electrical pattern traveling through pathways you don't consciously control. And when those pathways weaken, or slow, or shrink back to protect you, your emotional world dims, whether you want it to or not. One of the first systems affected is the dopamine reward circuit. Not the pleasure chemical myth you see on social media, but the real thing, a biological system that tells your brain, this matters, this is worth energy, this is worth showing up for. When you go through prolonged stress, weeks, months, sometimes years, your brain begins to conserve dopamine. It's a protective act, like lowering electricity usage in a city during a blackout. Your brain doesn't say, let's destroy joy. It says, let's keep the essential systems online. Breathing, basic focus, muscle tension, alertness, bare minimum functioning. Joy, curiosity, anticipation, creative energy. Those all get marked as non-essential. Luxuries, things that can wait until later, when the body is safe again. But here's the catch. Your body doesn't always know when later begins. So, the dimming continues. Another system steps in. Your insula, the part of your brain involved in emotional awareness, sensing what's happening inside your body. When it goes quiet, you stop registering the finer textures of feelings. Not all at once, but gradually, like a radio losing its signal. The channel is technically still there, but the sound is muffled, staticky, fading in and out. Then there's the amygdala, which most people only know as the fear center. That's not the full story. It's also the relevant center, the part that tells you something is important enough to react to. But when you're overloaded by grief, by pressure, by loneliness, by years of quietly enduring what you never had words for, the amygdala can downshift. Not hyperactive, not anxious, just tired. It stops tagging things as meaningful. It stops lighting the emotional dashboard. You don't feel panic. You don't feel much at all. People sometimes describe it as nothing matters. But neurologically, it's nothing registers. The world is happening, but your emotional sensors are in low power mode. Even your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for planning, reasoning, and making sense of your inner world, gets affected. It tries to keep up. It tries to understand. It tries to analyze what's happening, but it's trying to interpret dim signals through a fog. And the more it tries, the more exhausted you feel. This is why numbness often comes with overthinking. Your brain is searching for meaning in sensations that aren't coming through clearly. It's like trying to read a book in a dark room. You can strain your eyes, you can try to guess the words, but no amount of effort will bring the light back on. The nervous system doesn't respond to willpower. Here's another part people misunderstand. Numbness isn't just emotional, it's sensory. When the sympathetic nervous system has been triggered too long, months or years of tension, vigilance, self-protection, it doesn't snap back. It slides into a state called conservation mode. Heart rate normal, breathing shallow, energy low, motivation flat, emotions blunted. Not because you're failing to try, because your body is trying to protect you from burning out completely. What feels like, I can't feel anything, is actually, I don't have the safety or energy to feel anything yet. Let me say that again slowly. Your system isn't broken. It's conserving. It's waiting for conditions where feeling will not overwhelm you. This is where depersonalization, derealization, emotional blunting, and anhedonia overlap. Not as diagnoses, but as patterns, biological fallback modes, modes that tell you you've been surviving too long. You need a pause you never gave yourself. If all of this feels clinical, let me bring it closer to home. Every time your emotions dimmed, something inside you was saying, I need less noise. I need less pressure. I need space. I need breath. I need someone to stop asking more of me than I have to give. Emotionally numb, people aren't empty. They're overwhelmed. Their systems are whispering what their voices no longer know how to say. And when you view numbness through that lens, not as a flaw, not as failure, not as fragility, but as a biological protection mode, something inside you softens. You stop fighting your system. You start listening to it. Because at the end of the day, numbness isn't a disability of the heart. It's a wound of the nervous system. And every wound, every single one, comes with the possibility of repair if the environment becomes safe enough to heal. There's a truth most people never say out loud. When you pull back from the world, when you stop posting, stop sharing, stop wanting to be seen, it's not laziness, it's not apathy. It's a defense response with structure, almost like your mind is installing an internal security system. In psychology, there's a concept called psychological ownership. It describes the feeling of, this is mine, this space is mine, this part of my life belongs to me. But when you share yourself online, your thoughts, your face, your emotions, you're placing fragments of that ownership in the hands of strangers. And every time you're judged, misunderstood, dismissed, or consumed like a piece of content, your mind registers it as a kind of loss of internal property. Eventually, you feel something hollow that's hard to name. Not the loss of opportunity, not the loss of engagement, but the loss of ownership over yourself. Once it feels like you no longer own your inner life, you retreat to protect whatever is left. And here's the part people overlook. Your disappearance isn't weakness. It's your psyche pulling the emergency brake, saying, I can't afford to lose any more of myself. This withdrawal often comes paired with anhedonia, the shrinking ability to feel pleasure, emotional numbing, feelings turning flat or distant, hypervigilance, constant awareness of being watched or evaluated. Boundary erosion, your sense of where I end and others begin, becomes blurry. When these mechanisms activate together, your brain sends a very clear message. Stay inside. Don't expose anything. Protect the core. People who've been judged harshly, publicly criticized, chronically invalidated, or pushed to perform versions of themselves they never chose. They experience this phenomenon even more intensely. At a deeper level, the avoidance of posting isn't about the platform at all. It's about the fear of losing the last intact pieces of your identity. You stop showing yourself, not because you don't care, but because you're terrified of giving the world one more piece of you it could break. But here's the truth. Almost no one tells you. Withdrawal isn't the end of your story. It's the incubation phase, a necessary retreat before rebuilding a space you actually own, a space where you can reappear, not to be approved, not to be consumed, but to exist on your own terms. This isn't collapse. This is reconstruction. There's a pattern I've noticed, not in research papers, not in textbooks, but in people. People I've worked with, people I've loved, people who fell silent long before they had the language to explain why. And the pattern looks like this. You disappear from the world the moment the world stops feeling like a place where you exist. Not your persona, not your version, not the curated outlines you've been trained to present, but the real, unsupervised, unpolished you, the one that doesn't perform, doesn't decorate itself, doesn't edit before speaking. Most people don't lose motivation. They lose permission to be themselves. The retreat begins when you start feeling like a visitor inside your own life, like every action is being watched, evaluated, or quietly scored. It's subtle. It creeps in through the cracks. You don't even notice it happening. And then one day, you wake up and realize you haven't spoken in your real voice for months. This is the insight I return to again and again. People don't burn out because they're empty. They burn out because too many versions of them exist, and none of them feel like home. When you've spent too long shape-shifting, smoothing your edges, softening your tone, shrinking your needs, adjusting your posture, adjusting your personality, you eventually begin to experience a strange inner detachment. Not dissociation exactly, more like your selfhood drifting a few inches behind your body. You're there, but not really. And the more time you spend in this gap between who you are and who you perform as, the more your mind starts signaling. This isn't sustainable. Retreat, reclaim, regroup. Most people think silence is avoidance, but silence is often self-repair. Most think withdrawal is antisocial, But withdrawal is often the first moment you stop performing long enough to ask the real questions. Who am I when no one is watching? Who am I when I'm not optimizing myself? Who am I when I'm not being consumed? And it's in this quiet, introspective pause, the kind that feels like an emotional winter, that the most important realization emerges. You're not trying to escape the world. You're trying to find the version of you that didn't have to fight for space, the version that felt at home in their own head, the version that didn't censor their thoughts before they formed, the version that didn't collapse into numbness every time they were misunderstood. This is the heart of it. When you disappear, you're not vanishing. You're renegotiating the relationship between you and your identity. You're saying, I refuse to be a surface anymore. This is not depression. This is not failure. This is not you being dramatic. This is the psyche putting down a boundary so sacred, most people never recognize it. A boundary that says, no more versions of me that cost me myself. The retreat is not an ending, it's the doorway back to authenticity, the raw, unfiltered kind that can't be sold, packaged, or optimized. It's the moment you stop trying to be legible to everyone else and start becoming real to yourself again. There's a moment, somewhere deep in the quiet, when you start to realize that your withdrawal isn't just an emotional reaction, it's a reorganization, a structural shift, something your inner world has been trying to do for years, long before you had the courage to stop pretending everything was fine. Most people talk about burnout as if it's a single event, a collapse, a breaking point. But what I've learned across dozens of conversations and countless stories is this. Burnout is often the final chapter of a long, invisible negotiation between your nervous system and your identity. On one side, you have the biology, the brain begging for regulation, for safety, for a slower pace that actually matches the wiring underneath your personality. On the other side, you have the narrative, the expectations, the versions of you that were shaped by pressure, culture, comparison, survival, or subtle emotional demands you never questioned. When one side stops aligning with the other, the system fractures quietly. Your mind tries to maintain the version that pleases others. Your body tries to maintain the version that keeps you alive. And somewhere between the two, the real you gets lost. This is where withdrawal appears, not as avoidance, but as an attempt to reunite the pieces. Because here's the truth. You cannot live two different lives in one body without something shutting down. People talk about identity as if it's a single, stable thing. But identity is layered, stacked over time like geological sediment. There's who you are naturally, who you became to survive, who you perform to belong, who you pretend to be when you're tired of being all of the above. And the deeper the distance between these layers, the more fatigue turns into numbness, and numbness turns into withdrawal. This explains why disappearing feels strangely relieving. Not pleasant, but relieving. It lets you step out of the versions that can't hold you anymore. And once you step out, you begin to notice something else. Your silence is organizing you. It's pruning the roles you no longer need. It's dissolving the expectations that no longer fit. It's reminding you of parts you forgot existed. Silence becomes a kind of recalibration, almost like your psyche is whispering, before you return to the world, you need to remember who you're returning as. And that's the deeper conceptual expansion here. Withdrawal is not regression. It's identity defragmentation, a clearing of the psychological hard drive. Most people fear this phase because it feels empty. But emptiness is simply what happens when the false layers fall off faster than the real ones can grow back. If you're feeling lost right now, here's the gentle reframe. You're not losing yourself. You're losing what was never you. And the more you let those layers fall, the more you begin to sense something underneath, something quiet but steady. A self that doesn't need to perform to exist. This phase is uncomfortable, yes, but it's necessary. Because no one can build a life that feels like theirs until they reclaim the person inside the life. Recovery doesn't begin with a breakthrough moment. It begins with a shift so small you barely notice it. A loosening, a softening, a quiet space inside the noise where something finally exhales. People often imagine healing as a decision, a bold, I'm ready now. But in reality, it starts with something far less dramatic. Your nervous system stops fighting you. Not because things are perfect, not because you finally have clarity, but because your body begins to sense that maybe, just maybe, You're done forcing yourself to survive in ways that were hurting you. In this phase, the first step isn't rebuilding. It's relearning how to exist without armor, and that requires gentleness, not discipline. Because when numbness has become your shield, intensity becomes the enemy. Large goals, big resolutions, grand visions, they feel impossible, almost hostile. And that's not because you're broken, but because your mind has recalibrated around self-protection, not expansion. So recovery begins with something smaller, reintroducing signals of safety, not productivity, not motivation, not getting back to your old self. Safety in a nervous system coming out of withdrawal looks like this. Doing one thing at a time, lowering the emotional volume of your day, spending time in places where your body isn't bracing, letting silence exist without filling it, choosing connection that doesn't require performance. These aren't life hacks, they're reminders to your biology that the world isn't a threat, because here's the truth, most people never hear. Your brain won't let you rebuild until it knows you're safe. You can't think your way into healing. You have to feel your way into stability. And to do that, your recovery needs to be less about doing and more about allowing. Allowing rest without guilt. Allowing slowness without panic. Allowing yourself to take up space without offering an explanation. For someone who has lived in a high-functioning state of emotional overdrive, this is the real challenge, learning how to stop negotiating your worth through effort. And as you practice this, something subtle begins to happen. You start noticing small sparks of aliveness, the early signs that Anhedonia is loosening its grip. Maybe it's the taste of your morning coffee hitting differently for the first time in months. Maybe it's a moment where you laugh without forcing it. Maybe it's realizing you no longer feel the need to disappear every weekend just to survive the week. These moments are small, but they're not trivial. They're neurological green shoots, the first signs of reactivation in a system that has been shut down for too long. And if you pay attention to them, they grow. Recovery is not about suddenly loving life again. It's about reconstructing the capacity for feeling inch by inch. And that reconstruction follows a sequence: safety, regulation, subtle joy, meaning, connection. You can't jump steps. You can't negotiate shortcuts. This is the part people skip because it feels too slow, too quiet, too unremarkable. But that's exactly why it works. Because a nervous system that's been overwhelmed for years doesn't need intensity. It needs predictability. A morning ritual that doesn't change. A simple walk repeated every day. A place in your home where your breath naturally slows. A person you can speak to without performing. These small consistencies become the scaffolding of a new self. A self that doesn't collapse under the weight of expectations. And somewhere within this stability, you begin to remember something essential. You don't need to earn your right to exist, not through productivity, not through emotional labor, not through being endlessly reliable, not through being the strong one. Your worth isn't conditional on how much you endure. This realization, quiet, steady, almost fragile at first, is what begins to restore the ability to feel. Because when existence is no longer a battle, the nervous system can finally shift out of defense mode. And when defense mode shuts down, the world becomes reachable again. Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly, like dawn, the light edging in before you realize the darkness is fading. Recovery isn't a return to who you used to be. It's the emergence of someone who can finally breathe. There's a certain kind of quiet that only arrives after long seasons of internal collapse. Not the silence of isolation, but the silence of finally hearing yourself without distortion. A silence that feels less like emptiness and more like the return of gravity. If you're listening to this now, maybe you're standing at that strange threshold, not fully broken, not fully healed, suspended in the in-between, the place where everything feels slightly unfamiliar, even your own reflection. And maybe that's what makes this moment so disorienting. You're no longer drowning, but you're not yet on shore. You're breathing, but you don't fully trust the air. The world keeps moving, demanding versions of you that feel distant or impossible. But somewhere deeper, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the shutdown, beneath the numbness you've been calling fine, another truth is forming. You're not restarting your life. You're remembering it? There's a quiet ache in that realization. The ache of recognizing how much of yourself you had to abandon just to function, just to stay acceptable, just to survive environments that never once asked how your nervous system was actually doing. Most people don't understand that kind of fatigue. They mistake withdrawal for avoidance. They mistake numbness for indifference. They mistake stillness for giving up. But you know, and I know, that stillness only arrives when your internal world has been fighting for too long. Stillness is the body's last attempt to protect what's left. And as you step out of the noise, as you step back into your own interior space, there's a lesson slowly taking shape. One that sits quietly at the center of every season of collapse. You were never meant to carry this life at the speed you were taught. Your biology was never wired for constant urgency. Your nervous system was never built to outrun itself. Your identity was never designed to be carved into versions that pleased everyone but you. This is the real meaning of this entire journey: the recovery, the withdrawal, the numbness, the slow rebuilding. Your system wasn't failing you. It was trying to save you. That's the lesson most people never hear. Shutting down isn't weakness. It's intelligence. It's the psyche's way of saying, I can't keep pretending this life feels like mine. This phase you're in, this vast, quiet, unfamiliar space, isn't the aftermath of breaking. It's the beginning of alignment. The rebuilding won't be dramatic. It won't be a montage, or a breakthrough, or a sudden wave of energy. It will be understated, almost invisible to anyone who isn't paying attention. It will look like getting tired of abandoning yourself, choosing one small thing that feels true, saying no without apologizing, noticing the first flicker of desire returning, remembering what your own voice sounds like. And each time you do one of these things, your system rewires slightly. The numbness lifts by fractions. The world becomes less hostile, more reachable. Your inner life becomes more yours. You don't have to force this. You don't have to accelerate the process. You don't have to impress anyone with how well you're healing. The truth is simpler, softer, almost unbearably human. You are already moving. You are already returning. You are already becoming someone you can live with. And maybe that's the ending you didn't know you needed. Not a promise that everything will be okay, not a call to action, not a surge of optimism. Just this: a reminder that you're still here, a reminder that the quiet inside you is not a void, it's a bridge, a reminder that numbness doesn't mean nothing matters. It means something mattered too much for too long. A reminder that your withdrawal wasn't a disappearance. It was a search party sent inward. And now, you're beginning to find what was lost. Not all at once, not loudly, but steadily, in the dim, in the slow unfolding of a life that finally feels like it might fit. And when you're ready to step forward again, not for the world, not for expectation, but for yourself, you'll know. Because the moment will feel quiet and true and unmistakably yours.